Colleagues and friends, I wish to begin by thanking Eudoxia and all of the organizers for inviting me to speak at this auspicious occasion. And I take the opportunity to begin by expressing my deep appreciation and admiration for the important fieldwork and research carried out by several generations of Polish archaeologists in the Mediterranean and beyond. As just mentioned by Eudoxia, my personal experience of this revolves around Cyprus, where I came for the first time as a student in the spring of 1974. I have since then returned many times, and it has always been a pleasure to meet and exchange views with my Polish colleagues working in Paphos, from whom I and we have learned so much about the archaeology of the island. This would not, however, have been possible without the assistance and encouragement by the Cypriot authorities and colleagues who have created an ideal environment for archaeological collaboration, which is, I think, almost unrivaled in the Mediterranean. So I would like to extend my thanks to them. And now I will begin the paper. The aim of this contribution is to raise the question as if a study of fluctuations in Cypriot connectivity from about 400 BC to AD 300 may throw light on some aspects of the history of the island in these centuries. My point of departure is a statement made by Anayasta in 1960, and he said, in the Cypriot classical period, new Koine tendencies appear, preparing the uniform civilizations of Hellenistic and Roman times. The implied notion, namely that Cyprus became so immersed in a supposed Hellenistic and Roman koine that the arts and crafts of the island ceased to follow local traditions and may no longer be regarded as expressions of a true Cypriot character, has been echoed by several scholars since then, even if some are now advocating a softer approach. But our understanding of the koine concept has advanced considerably since Yasta's time, and current knowledge of the archaeology of Cyprus suggests that pronounced regional differences continue to make themselves felt in the Hellenistic and perhaps to a lesser degree in Roman times. And I therefore agree with Mark van der Enden's statement, and he said, koine is perhaps better described as a superficial veneer masking the variety present underneath. It is nevertheless, I think, reasonable to link the perception that the two periods, the Hellenistic and Roman periods, differed in some way from the previous ones with the fact that Cyprus was set on a fundamentally different trajectory, where the island was unified politically about 300 BC under foreign powers, at first the Ptolemaic kingdom and later the Roman Empire. The abolition of the autonomous polities was associated with the destruction of one of the former royal centers, Marion, and the transfer of its inhabitants to Paphos. Some of the other centers, for instance, Kichon, went into decline, but the change was also accompanied by the foundation of Arsinoe in the early 3rd century BC and the emergence of a new capital near Paphos. And surveys have consistently shown that the Hellenistic and Roman periods were characterized by settlement expansion and increased prosperity nearly everywhere, a decline only setting in at some time during the 2nd century AD, broken by an upsurge in the Severian periods. In these respects, Cyprus broadly followed what happened elsewhere in the Levant, but in the developments in Cyprus seems to have had some context for the connectivity of the island, which have not, at least not to my knowledge, been noticed elsewhere. Connectivity has been considered a key element in ancient history, at least since Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell published The Corrupting Sea in 2005. It is closely associated with the concepts of mobility and network theories and may be studied using a variety of methods. This contribution will approach it through the evidence for the presence of Cypriots outside the island and of exports of Cypriot commodities. Jean Poyot, Ino Nicolaou, Antoine Marie, and Eustachius Raptu have gathered and discussed inscriptions, graffiti made by or referring to Cypriots outside the island, as well as ancient authors' references to the same. And their studies form the basis of this presentation. As noted by Marie, the whole issue is certainly in need of new comprehensive analysis, but such an attempt is outside the scope of this contribution, which focuses on the chronological distribution of the evidence. I have also here noted a few more recent publications I've come across, relevant ones, which are listed at the bottom of this slide. So in the 4th century BC, our data comprises no less than 162 cases, of which the vast majority, 135, are graffiti made by Cypriot mercenaries in Egypt. Some 60 syllabary and 5 alphabetic inscriptions from Karnak, close to 50 syllabary and 5 or 6 alphabetic ones from Abydos, as well as 2 inscriptions from the Cheops pyramid and 1 from Naucratis. 37 instances are known from other parts of the Mediterranean, mainly epitaphs brought to light in Piraeus, Athens, and Eleusis. Many of the deceased were presumably merchants and their wives, and an inscription testifies to a Cypriot koinon at Piraeus. Most individuals came from Kition and Salamis, but persons from Marion, Soloi, Paphos, and Amatus are also documented. Moreover, inscriptions referring to Cypriots have also been found in Chalkis, Delos, Delphi, and at Panticipaeon in the Black Sea region. I should note perhaps that the figures the numbers I'm mentioning should be taken with a grain of salt, and I will return to this question later. But they give at least an idea of the quantities involved. In the 3rd century BC, the number of cases known to me drops to 43, the decrease being particularly steep in Egypt, where 13 inscriptions or graffiti made by Cypriots, mostly mercenaries from Paphos, Salamis, and Soloi, have been recorded at Abydos and Thebes, together with a single inscription from Alexandria. A decline is also evident elsewhere, with a total of 30 documented instances, mainly Salaminians and Parthians in Rhodes, home to a koine or 2 koine, one of Laphiastae and one of Haphiastae. And Parthians, Amathutians, and Salaminians are also documented in Delphi. To these can be added 4 epitaphs found at Demetrius in Thessaly, naming individuals from Paphos, Amatus, Korion, as well as evidence from Delos and Athens. In Athens, I would especially mention the philosopher Zenon from Kition and his pupil Persias, and there's also some documentation from Amorgos and Syria. In the 2nd century BC, out of 35 examples, Egypt only accounts for 6, 2 elephant hunters from Korion at Abu Simbel, a soldier from Paphos at Koptos, and perhaps up to 3 further individuals at Thebes. There are 28 instances from the rest of the Mediterranean. Delos takes a clear lead with 16 references to Cypriots from Salamis, Kaphasos, and Paphos, followed by Delphi with 4, and Rhodes and Athens with 2 each, again from Salamis, Kaphasos, and Paphos. And one can also refer to 2 ambassadors who went to Rome. In the 1st century BC, only 14 cases are known, to me at least, of which 3 come from Egypt, including a mercenary at Hermopolis Mauna, a soldier from Paphos and Koptos, and a physician from Kition in Alexandria. The remaining 11 testimonia comprise 2 Salaminians and 1 Parthian, each in Athens and Rhodes, a Parthian and a Salaminian each in Kos, a Salaminian in Delos, and a Parthian in Orchomenos, as well as a victor in the Terminian Games. Nicolaou noted that, and I quote, the presence of Cypriots abroad is not that strong in the Roman period, which accords well with the total number of such individuals being 21, corresponding to an average of about 7 for each of the first 3 centuries AD. There now seems to be no evidence from Egypt, from 5 cases from Athens and Piraeus, which involve 3 Salaminians, a Kythian and a Paphian. 2 Paphians, 1 Salaminian, and the Kythian are documented from Delphi, and there's evidence of a Salaminian at Oropha, Sparta, Paros, Stratonicaea, and Antioch, though I think it's possible that some of these individuals might have originated in the island of Salamis rather than in Cyprus. But interestingly, there are also evidence of 3, perhaps 4 Cypriots in Rome, and 1 each at Naples and Messina in the Western Mediterranean. And references should finally be made to 3 inscriptions referring to a cohort Cypria, which served in the Black Sea area from the second half of the 1st century into the 2nd century AD. As previously noted, the figures I've quoted for each century must be approached with a great deal of caution, because not all sources need to imply the actual presence of a person from Cyprus. It is, for instance, far from certain that Cypriots who were granted proxenia outside the island ever visited the cities in question. Moreover, the numbers only represent a minimum because it's hard to estimate the number of Cypriot members of a given koine or of the cohorts Cypria. So, in what I've been saying, for the sake of consistency, each has been attributed to the number 1, which is certainly far too low. Especially the cohorts Cypria, I've been kind of informed by Tunis Becker Nielsen, originally comprised about 500 individuals who were initially enrolled in Cyprus, but later came to include local recruits in the Black Sea area. So I think it's wise to omit the mercenaries from the calculation. And if we do so, we can still see that there's, or seems to be, a steady decline in the number of Cypriots outside the island, as you can see from this slide. The figure drops from about 40 in the 4th century to about 32 in the 3rd, to about 30 in the 2nd century, about 12 in the 1st century BC, and 7 each for each of the 1st centuries AD. And more or less the same pattern seems to emerge from a survey of the evidence for exportation of Cypriot ceramics in the same period. I will not go into so much detail with this because I dealt with it in some length with my publication on the circulation of ceramics in Cyprus, which Eudoxia kindly referred to. But I will begin with speak a little bit about the Cypriot-made ceramic lac-gloss and color-coded finewares from the Hellenistic period. Seems mainly have been exported to sites on the Levantine coast in Egypt, but as far as one can see, in rather limited quantities, and the bulk of these finds dates from the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC. I have to admit that this assessment may in part be caused by our inability to identify pottery made in Cyprus outside the island, but it is supported by the distribution of the perhaps more readily recognizable Cypriot amphora stamps from mainly the 3rd century BC, which have been found in Egypt and the Levant. In Alexandria, which is the major find spot, Cypriot amphora stamps comprise 10% of the total stamp handles dating to the late 4th and 3rd centuries BC, but only 4% of the amphora types from rescue excavations dated to the Hellenistic period in general. In the Roman period, the situation becomes even more obscure because we are not really able to identify with certainty Cypriot amphora types from the Roman period on the export markets if, as now I think seems likely, the bulk, if not all, of the so-called pinch-handle amphorae were produced in rough Cilicia rather than also in Western Cyprus as previously believed. At least there's no evidence from kilns showing that this type was also produced in Cyprus, Western Cyprus, although it's quite frequently found there. We cannot be sure either that the So sigillata was actually produced in the island, and the widespread distribution of this ware can no longer be considered unambiguous evidence for a substantial export of Cypriot pottery in the Roman period, even if the verdict is still out on this. I have here marked the what I would say the most likely area of production of Cypriot sigillata, but we cannot pinpoint the exact area in southern Asia Minor or in Western Cyprus until we have found some kilns. Of course, the archaeologically visible Cypriot exports may only represent the tip of an iceberg, since grain, textiles, and other organic materials are largely lost. But one is nevertheless left with a clear impression that export of Cypriot pottery was always at a rather low and even declining level throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods. And even if one is to assume that Cypriot sigillata was actually made in Western Cyprus, it would not change this impression that much. So I think that this pattern, or this parent pattern, corresponds to what seems to be the decline in the number of Cypriots who were active outside the island in the same periods. And rather surprisingly, I would think the exact opposite is often claimed for some of the prehistoric periods. In the Bronze and Iron Ages, Susan Scherer has suggested that, and I quote, Cypriots were largely responsible for carrying out the thriving pottery trade in the Levant in the 14th and 13th century BC, and Bernard Knapp has argued that we are dealing with a diverse, highly specialized, and well-organized polity that coordinated, if not controlled, transport, communication, and exchange within and beyond the island between about 1750 and 1100 BC. An active role has also been attributed to the islanders in the first millennium BC. You can, for instance, see this. This is just one example, the quotation by Petia Ilieva from 2019. But many or several others could be adduced, and there's also good evidence for the presence of Cypriots outside the island from the Archaic period to the Classical period in the written sources. I readily admit that our data concerning Cypriot connectivity from the Bronze and Iron Age is so diverse and in many hard to quantify that it's hard to reliably relate the connectivity in one period to that of another. But if it is nevertheless accepted as a working hypothesis that the number of Cypriots active outside the island in the Hellenistic and particularly in the Roman periods was smaller than before and even decreasing, the next logical question could be to ask for the reasons for this apparent difference. A clue to the answer may, in my view, be encapsulated in Louisa Steele's observation about the active involvement of Cypriots in the maritime trade of the late Bronze Age, which you can see on the bottom of this slide. And she wrote, the late Bronze Age was also characterized by increased Cypriot involvement in maritime trade around the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, reaching a peak in the 14th and 13th centuries BC. Cypriot participation in this trade was dependent on exploitation of the rich copper resources located in the foothills of the Troodos Mountains. Indeed, as is very well known, the exploitation of these copper resources was quite central to the island's economy, at least from the second millennium BC onwards, and copper continued to be a major resource for the Iron Age kingdoms, even if a part of the revenue from the mines was presumably paid as a tribute to the island's Assyrian and later Egyptian and Persian overlords. But the corollary of the observation made by Louisa Steele is that one might expect to see a diminished involvement of Cypriots in the overseas maritime trade if the island was to lose control of this resource, as it actually did in the Roman and in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. It is generally assumed that ownership of the copper mines of Cyprus fell to the Ptolemaic kings when the island became part of the Ptolemaic Empire, and an inscribed statue based on Paphos refers to a certain Potamos as antistrategos and chief administrator of the mines. These later became the property of the Roman state, and Augustus gave King Herod half the revenue of the copper mines in the island and entrusted him with the management of the other half, according to Josephus in the Jewish Antiquities. But the mines reverted to Rome after the death of Herod, and archaeological fieldwork in the mining districts of Cyprus by, for instance, the Troodos Archaeological Survey Project has shown that the mines in this area continued to be exploited even at an increased level throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods into late antiquity. Radiocarbon dates and actual finds made at some of the mines and copper production sites also show that there was a continued exploitation of these mines in the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, or the Roman period at large, as well as perhaps especially in late antiquity. Timber was another crucial economic resource that Cyprus lost control of in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The forests of Cyprus assumed great importance to the Ptolemies, since the island was allegedly the only wooded area under Ptolemaic control. Cyprus became a center for Ptolemaic shipbuilding, an age characterized by an arms race involving increasingly large-sized warships. And shipbuilding also continued to play an important role for Cyprus in the Roman period. Also, timber was also in heavy demand by the mining industry. It is very difficult to assess the value of the timber and copper resources in absolute terms, but according to Plutarch, the younger Cato confiscated no less than 7,000 talents from the last Ptolemaic ruler in Cyprus, a huge sum that may in part have accumulated from the exploitation of these mines. Herod in turn presented Caesar with 300 talents, which some scholars think corresponded to the revenue of the Cypriot mines, though Simon Dar believes that this figure is too low. And in this paper I've referred to on this slide, he has even suggested that the income derived from Herod's lease on the Cypriot mines was an important factor in financing his grandiose construction projects, which included the harbor of Caesarea. This claim is probably exaggerated, but it is difficult to believe that the loss of control of two of the island's key economic resources did not impact its economy negatively. So, to conclude, the presently known evidence suggests that the number of Cypriots that were active outside the island declined from the 4th century BC onwards, reaching a low in the Roman period. And the export of Cypriot ceramics seems to have followed a similar pattern. We are, however, certainly dealing with a complex picture because Cypriots seem to have ventured further from home to Rome, Messina, and Naples in the Roman period than before, even if the corresponding evidence from Egypt and Rhodes now appears to have to be missing. Nevertheless, the decline in the 1st centuries BC and AD is very surprising, to say the least, because the Mediterranean otherwise experienced a peak of connectivity and interregional trade in the late Hellenistic and early imperial periods. I've illustrated this with the quite famous graph showing the chronological distribution of wrecks originally compiled by Parker and updated several times since then. But I have suggested that one reason, perhaps a major reason for this decline, could be that an active Cypriot involvement in the metal trade became irrelevant when the mines became the property of the Ptolemaic kings at first and later the Roman emperors, and that this could have led to a reduced export of Cypriot ceramics and by implication perhaps other goods as well on the overseas markets, especially if credit is given to the so-called piggyback theory that ceramics and other goods were transported overseas as space fillers in cargoes of more expensive but archaeologically invisible commodities. It is noticeable that evidence for Cypriot merchants overseas seems to have declined from the 4th century BC, when there appears to have been a robust presence of merchants in Piraeus and Athens, through the 3rd and 2nd centuries, where most of the relevant evidence comes from Rhodes and Delos. And there hardly, or I don't think there's any evidence of merchants among the Cypriots abroad in the 1st century BC and in the Roman period. Previous scholarship has not, of course, failed to notice that Cyprus was deprived of income for her mines and forests under Ptolemaic and Roman rule, but the hypothesis put forward in this paper implies that the negative consequences of this deprivation might have been more severe than what is generally assumed. Nevertheless, the archaeological evidence indicates that Cyprus flourished for most of these periods, which I would say testifies to the quite robust, strong economy, general economy of the island, which is perhaps due to the fact that the island was largely self-sufficient, as Terence Mitford suggested already some 40 years ago. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.